You're listening to Tatiana is Everyone, an Orphan Black podcast. My name is Kris.
And my name is Stephanie. In this episode, we are discussing Orphan Black Deviations, which is a comic book miniseries that recently came out via IDW. And we will be discussing some spoilery elements of that series, so if you do not want to know things that happen in this particular comic book miniseries, just as a warning, there are spoilers ahead.
Okay, so let's talk about what Orphan Black Deviations is, in case anybody doesn't know. It's a comic book miniseries, as Stephanie just said, written by Helly Kennedy and with art by Wayne Nichols and Sebastian Cheng. It was released by IDW in 2017 and 2018. As of this recording, the trade paperback is recently available. It's sort of a what-if setup, asking what the plot of Orphan Black would have been like if Beth hadn't died. The series touches on a lot of events from the entire 5 seasons of the show, maybe less so season 3, I feel like.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's season 3 and season 5. There's less of those elements in this.
So shall we do some quick reviews, what we thought of the series?
Yeah, just some general thoughts about the series. I feel like we're trying to be a bit more vague at this point if some people want to listen to what we thought of it first before they go read it. So we're going to try not to be too spoilery in this section, I think. I think it's a very interesting rabbit hole to go down because Beth committing suicide is the instigator of this whole storyline that gets Sarah drawn into Clone Club and starts the whole thing. So I do think it's an interesting thing to kind of spool out. Okay, what if that hadn't concluded that way? What might have been different? I definitely didn't dislike Deviations, but I can't really say that I liked it either. Like there were moments that I liked a lot, but I feel like the writers either tried to tackle or they had to tackle a bit too much in 6 issues. I felt pretty into it in the beginning. There was one book where I put it down. I was like, oh, I need to pick up the next one. Like I was kind of engrossed in what was going on. But toward the end, I felt really bounced around in the storyline and I just wasn't entirely sure what was happening where. So it's a very plotty version of Orphan Black, and there wasn't a whole lot of time for character development. So I'm sorry to speak for you, Kris, but I feel like maybe we weren't the best target audience for it because you and I are really all about character arcs and character development.
It's true. I have a lot of the same feelings about this that you do. Like, I'm not really sure how to feel about the miniseries. I think it's an interesting premise. And I do like that we get to spend more time with a couple of characters who die pretty quickly in the show. But like you mentioned, Stephanie, I found myself kind of confused about what was happening fairly frequently. I'm not sure if that's because of me, though, or the comic. Like, it could be a me thing, just because as I'm reading it, I'm like, okay, but I don't know, it sort of rubs up against in my brain against the actual story. Because I get a bit of cognitive dissonance when I'm like, if I'm watching a movie adaptation of a book that I have read, I'm like, okay, but that's not how that goes. Which is sort of a ridiculous thought to have. I recognize that they are two separate things, but also, I don't know, there's just part of me that's just kind of like, but this is not the thing that I was expecting. Granted, going into this comic book, I know that that's the premise, is like, what if this huge thing changed? But I don't know, stuff happens in different order than it happens in the TV show. There's stuff that's very similar, but also feels very different, if that makes sense. Relationships that happened very differently, but also scenes that happen essentially the same. You know what I mean?
I do. I am, though, very curious who might enjoy Deviations the most, whether it would be people who saw the entire series. Well, I guess there could be 3 categories. There could be really hardcore Orphan Black fans like us who really tried to follow the plot lines very carefully, or you can have people who watch the whole series more casually, Or you could have folks who aren't really familiar with the series at all and just happen to stumble upon this comic book. Because of the premise, seeing the show would help you appreciate the differences that they're weaving into the story. Mm-hmm. But like you were saying, we also, those of us who've seen the series, also have this sense of, oh, but I liked what happened in the show better. Or there's this confusion of, but wait, I thought so-and-so did this. Oh, that's right. It happened this way in the comic and it happened this other way on the show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do also have to mention that I definitely did not like the way this story ended.
No!
I'm coming out firmly against it. As a surprise to no one who has listened to this podcast before.
No, I got to the end and I thought, oh, Kris is going to hate this.
Kris did. Kris did hate it. Kris got to a point, I think early in the last issue, maybe, where I was just kind of like, you know, we haven't had any main character deaths. This is probably not going to end well. Like, I had that thought. That creeping dread thought where you're just kind of like, oh no, they're gonna kill somebody. I hate being right sometimes.
So do we want to move into talking a bit more specifically about things?
Sure. Consider that your warning, listeners.
Yes. Spoiler warning, spoilers ahead. So since you were just talking about major character deaths, etc., the body count is very different in the miniseries versus the TV series. Because the story covers essentially... It kind of covers the span of season 1, it feels like, time-wise. And it's like bookended by the same beginning and end, essentially. Mm-hmm. Taking into consideration who all died or survived season 1... So we have Katya, the first one for sure. Katya survives. She is not shot by Helena. And I was kind of happy about that. Like, I thought that her reunion with MK was actually really sweet.
Mm-hmm. I was pleased with how much Katya we got. It's like, oh, this is what she was like, maybe. And I do really feel like that's where the strength of this comic is like, okay, you know, you, the readers, probably already are kind of familiar with the rest of the characters, so let's give you more of these characters that you maybe aren't as familiar with.
I almost put MK on my survived body count list, but she doesn't technically die within the season 1 timeline, so I'm not going to put her on there. But she does have a decent chunk of storyline here, and it's an important storyline. And it was another, like you mentioned, like another way for us to interact with her more, even though she wasn't around as much in the series. And then the other person that I made note of surviving season 1 was Olivier. He's in this only briefly. We do get a shot of his tail, which I kind of appreciated. But he doesn't really... Like, he didn't have a huge piece in season 1, but he had, I feel like, even less of a piece of the story here.
I mean... If they're gonna show us the tail, I want Helena slicing it off and having a dance party with it. Like, that was... It's such a great, iconic, like, weirdly iconic moment in the series.
I know.
That's okay, though.
And then the other person who died in season 1, but we don't see die here, is Amelia. And the reason she doesn't die is she doesn't show up at all.
Yeah, the Sarah Helena storyline plays out very differently in this, which also makes me kind of sad. But
so I think that's it on our survivors list. And then on our deaths list, we have Vic, who dies. And I don't know, maybe I'm just like smushing together season 2 and season 1 Vic, but he came across as a lot more sinister to me in the miniseries. I remember him being sinister in the beginning of season 1, but having a bit more of a dark comedy element to him toward the end, but he never got to that point in the miniseries.
Yeah, I think the turn actually happens when Felix just straight up tells Vic that Sarah died. Which, of course, doesn't happen here, so...
Right, because she's not pretending to be Beth.
Right. I guess he does stay much more in that version that we first see of him basically accosting Felix.
And then I was actually surprised that this happened. I didn't think they would do it. But Rachel and Ferdinand both seem to, at least, die in this. Granted, technically, if they were coming back for season 2 of Deviations, that could be a surprise miracle they both survived. It seems like something those writers might do. But for all intents and purposes, from what we know, both Ferdinand and Rachel die because they were in the explosion that MK created. And they were right by the bomb, so it seems unlikely they would have survived.
Yes, but like in TV land on Orphan Black, I agree, you're right. It seems like a thing where they'd be like, oh, surprise, they somehow survived. They were close to the thing that exploded, but also there was a trap door that was even closer. That happened to be a bomb shelter. It's fine. Or something. This is why I am not a TV writer.
And if we're going to extrapolate a little bit, if Ferdinand died, then ostensibly, if the story continued, that means that he couldn't kill MK and he couldn't kill Mrs. S. So that made me happy. Again, in this Orphan Black universe, they could still die some other way. But if he died here, he'd be taken off the table and he couldn't kill them. So that kind of made me happy for a minute. And then Sarah comes running out of the building dressed as Beth and Helena shoots her. And I was so sad.
Yeah. Not cool. Orphan Black Deviations. Not cool.
But you know what it reminded me of, Kris? Do you remember? I can't remember if it was between seasons 1 and 2 or between seasons 2 and 3. But there was that post going around where somebody was making the argument that if Orphan Black wanted to be like an edgy show, the thing that it needed to do was to kill Sarah Manning.
There were various posts. I think the thing that you're talking about was actually an article that somebody had wrote. Like a critic had written it.
That's what I'm talking about, yeah.
It infuriated me, and I talked about it extensively when we were on a panel at DragonCon, and I got all worked up about it. I'm still all worked up about it, because how dare you?
I don't know, and granted, this was just my personal reaction to it, but that inclusion of having Sarah being killed there, it kind of felt like the writers being like, see, critic, how did you like that, huh? I hope you feel crappy now.
I'm pretty sure it was between seasons 2 and 3, that article.
Yeah, but that's probably just me channeling my spite through other people.
What? One of us spiteful?
Never happened. The thing is, though, Kris, because of the setup of this story, Sarah wasn't nearly as well-developed a character. And that's not me trying to say that, oh, it's okay that they killed her then. But it does feel different seeing that Sarah die, like that version of Sarah die, versus how it would have felt to see the Sarah we got in Orphan Black the series die at the end of season 2 or season 3.
It's true.
It still makes me very sad because, you know, she has a kid, and, you know, the very ending where essentially Helena comes and recruits Kira to be another avenging angel type. That's even, I think, more upsetting.
Yeah, the whole Helena arc was upsetting to me.
Right. And I think that's another like major difference that we see here due to Beth surviving is that I think especially with Helena, she does not connect with Sarah, so she doesn't start her redemption arc midway through this whole process. She is just an antagonist the entire time.
Yep.
And she's also not around as much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's sort of the thing is it feels like Sarah's connections to pretty much everybody are less significant in this when Beth survives.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. I feel like Clone Club doesn't seem to gel as much in Deviations as it does in the first season of Orphan Black.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they kind of all come together at the end to try to get Kira back. But it happens very late in the proceedings, whereas it felt there was at least a grudging acceptance that they needed each other earlier on in season 1 to me.
Right, which could, as harsh as this sounds, kind of be the cruel reality of, okay, somebody is clearly hunting us since we are dying off one by one. I mean, with the immediate loss of Beth and Katya, you know, there's that sort of inciting incident of not only grief, but grief and something drastic is happening. And I think the fact that Beth was really the one who brought them together and was essentially the leader of the group it created a stronger need for stronger bonds between them.
There were a couple of other... redemption arc maybe isn't the best word for them, but I'm going to go with it. I know there were people who routinely, throughout season 2 and 3 even, weren't entirely sure where Delphine's loyalties lie. And I think it's fair at the end of season 1, you're not 100% sure. Here, I found it even more difficult to be certain that Delphine really was on the clone's side. Like, I know she helps break Kira out of dyad at the end there. But because, like, her and Cosima meeting each other and them starting their relationship starts a little bit later, I don't know. To me, it just felt like Delphine trying to kind of switch her allegiance. It felt a little too rushed for me to buy it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, this is part of what I was talking about earlier with the whole... There's some stuff that happens that is essentially the same as it happens in the series, but it feels very different. I feel like that's, like, a prime example is the relationship between Delphine and Cosima. Because we get a lot of the exact same scenes, but they feel completely different to me. Like the scene where Delphine sleeps with Cosima and then starts rifling through her stuff. And of course, part of why that feels so different is, one, it feels like Cosima trusts her less in the comics to me. I don't know if it felt that way to you.
No, I think so too.
Okay. And then also, Delphine actually sells out Sarah and Kira, much to my shock.
I know. I was shocked too.
Yeah, I kind of couldn't figure out why that change was made. I mean, like, narratively, I understand why they'd be like, well, here's a way to get from point A to point B. But just under the premise of Beth doesn't die and things change, I'm like, I don't quite see how this relationship feels so different than it does. Unless it's just a timeline thing, right? Because Beth not dying does seem to alter certain things, like the sequence of events in certain ways. And again, I can't tell if that's me thinking that or if it's, you know, what's actually happening in the comic, just because it is a different medium and stuff plays out a little differently just through necessity. But I don't know. I just got very confused about the pacing of it, I guess.
Yeah. And again, this could be a limitation of the comic book. You have more subtle facial expressions and things like that going on when you have human beings saying these lines. But when we were seeing, like, Delphine communicating with Leaky, she didn't seem to be as waffling in her allegiance as early on in the storyline as she does in the TV show. But at the same time, I think it's a good point to raise. Why did Delphine not tell Leaky about Kira in this series? It felt like that might have come from some affection she had for Cosima, but it also felt like maybe she had a moment of, oh my goodness, there's a child caught up in this.
Right. Human compassion is what it was.
Yeah. So why would she be less compassionate just given the fact that Beth didn't die? Yeah, I think that's a good point that you raise. And I think another element that maybe made Cosima and Delphine's relationship feel very different here to me was that Cosima being symptomatic, I don't believe was ever brought up. I don't think they got to that part.
Yeah, if they did, I don't remember it.
Yeah, I know they showed Katya coughing a lot, but I don't think they actually got to where Cosima was symptomatic. And that is really something urgent that sort of repairs their broken trust at the end of that season and helped the viewer feel like, okay, Delphine really cares. Maybe she really is on their side. I think they tried to do that here with her helping with Kira, but she just kind of pops up out of nowhere at Dyad, and it just doesn't feel as genuine as those scenes between the two of them and Cosima confessing that she's sick to Delphine at the end of season 1.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, again, I hesitate to call this a redemption arc, and it's more of a in the future type of thing, but Rachel dies here, so she doesn't have a chance to become slightly less terrible over the course of whatever might happen after this.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course, I mean, there's the whole thing, like, we didn't even see Rachel until the very end of season 1, so she's much more present in this. And yeah, it's that whole thing of, I don't know, amount of exposure the characters get to one another, I feel like is a big factor in the differences between this miniseries and the TV show.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, me reading this series is just kind of like, but that's not supposed to happen until, oh, wait. This is not the TV show. Things happen differently here. It's a different story. It's an AU, Kris.
It is an AU. And I think, as you were kind of alluding to earlier, and this makes complete sense, the fact that Beth survives brings in these plot elements from season 4 much earlier into the process, because we saw in the flashbacks in season 4, Beth was working with MK and they were looking at the maggot bots and dyad, and MK had information about Rachel Duncan and Ferdinand. And so instead of Beth's death being a catalyst that like puts Sarah into the middle of Clone Club, what happens, it like brings a different perspective on Helena. Instead, Sarah acts as a catalyst to sort of make Beth unite her kind of fragmented Clone Club. Right,
because it seemed like in the show, what we find out in season 4 is that Beth was getting, maybe getting ready to tell the others about these things. Then she runs into Evie Cho, and Evie Cho basically convinces her to not do that and instead commit suicide to keep the others safe. This is ostensibly what could have happened had she not done that.
Which is why it makes sense to me that we see a lot of the plot elements from seasons like 2 and 4 in this storyline, but not really anything from seasons 3 or 5, because that was information that was acquired by Clone Club completely separate from what Beth would have known.
Yeah, or only tangentially related to Beth stuff, since it turns out that the military stuff was something that Beth maybe kind of knew part of.
Did it feel like to you, though, that there was less Beth than you thought there would be? Not that I necessarily thought it would be a direct swap where Beth had as prominent a role in the storyline as Sarah did in season 1. I guess maybe I did think that. I thought maybe Beth would be more the driver of the storyline here, given that that's the setup, that she survived rather than committing suicide.
Yeah, I guess now that you mention it, yeah.
But instead, she's actually gone for a chunk of time where she's kidnapped by Evie Cho. But at the end of the season, there is kind of a swap, Beth for Sarah. She really takes the lead again. But I guess if I think about it, that makes sense, because she almost committed suicide. She's very distraught, and she can't immediately be better. So it feels like she does some lost weekending a bit. Like I mentioned, she gets kidnapped. She's going through some stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But then she emerges as more of a, not heroic figure, that's maybe overstating it, but she becomes like the lead character who's sort of driving what the clones are doing to deal with their problems.
Right. Yeah, now that you mention it, though, I did have a moment where reading it, and we get to that part where she's sort of going through some self-destructive stuff and being like, oh no, what is going on here? It's not surprising necessarily, but it's also pretty concerning. And just to tell you about some of the other things that we are talking about on our other podcasts, we've recently released a new episode of our Lost Girl podcast, Drinks at the Doll, in which we talk about episode 301, Caged Fae. It is a fun but also critical discussion, so keep that in mind.
Yes, I know that one is a favorite of especially people who ship Bo and Lauren. So while it is a fun episode, I think generally we do have some elements of that story that we critique. So be prepared.
And you can listen to that over at our website, drinksatthedoll.com.
And then over on our multi-fandom podcast, Finalysis, on which primarily these days we've been talking about Kara and Lena, aka Supercorp, from the TV series Supergirl. We recently released a episode in which we discussed the subtext between those two characters from the sort of middle section of season 3, is episodes 310 through 313, which finished airing a few weeks ago now. And it's pretty silly and ridiculous, and I can't even keep our own headcanon straight, but hopefully I think it's entertaining for folks. And And we also give some recommendations for Supercorp fanfic at the end of that episode. So you can go find that over on our website, askgenretv.com/fan.
So silly. And to wrap up our Orphan Black Deviations talk, I think we should talk about some of our favorite moments from the miniseries.
Do you want me to go first?
Yes, go first, please.
Okay, so I got unusually excited by the fact that somebody finally answered the darn riddle in the context of season 1. Because when Beth came to pick up Katya and rescued her from Vic pursuing her, Katya asks Beth the riddle, just one, I'm a few, no family two, who am I? And Beth responds, I'm you! Like, somebody answered it!
That's right, because I think either Graham Manson or John Fawcett did answer the question online somewhere, but they answered a clone. And I'm like, that's kind of disappointing, but I'm you is a much better answer. Sorry, John and Graham.
No, it's a much better answer. And we saw Katya try to use it on Vic earlier, where she said the phrase, and then when he answered, he said, you're Sarah. And that's when she knew, oh, he's not somebody who's part of Clone Club that I should trust with my samples, etc. So it became clearer to me how it might function. And I liked the answer, I'm you. It made me happy.
I'm glad it made me happy also. This is such a minor moment, but I really enjoyed Allison's line, shaming is for priests, Beth. I don't know why, it just made me laugh really hard.
It was a great Allison line. She did a lot of creative swearing, which I enjoyed, but that was my favorite line of hers, was shaming is for priests, Beth. And speaking of good lines, this one's a little bit on the nose, but it just felt very Felix, where he's like separating Allison and Sarah. Excuse me, he's separating Beth and Sarah, who are getting into an argument over fairly Sarah sleeping with Paul. And he says to them, you're both ridiculous, walking proof that flakiness, righteous indignation, and idiotic violence are genetic. I just loved how thoroughly he called them out on their BS.
It is a very Felix thing to do, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Felix.
But then I have to say, I think probably my favorite panel of the comic was in the 6th issue. On the first page, it's where they're talking about trying to go into Dyad to get Kira back. And Sarah's kind of challenging Beth, saying, like, why the heck would you risk your neck for my daughter? And there's this great panel, and I think Beth's expression is really good. I'm going to read it. I'm going to read what she says, but it has swears, so I'm going to clean it up a little bit. and Beth says in response to, like, why is she willing to risk her neck like this to help Kira? She says, I wasn't a mess up before all of this stuff. I make a lot of mistakes with everyone, with you, Sarah, but not with Kira. Jerkface Leaky can't control us anymore. If I got to take the fall to stop him, I will. And I think it was a really good, like, Beth moment that she didn't get to have in the actual timeline. And I don't know, that just landed really hard for me.
I really like that also. And now I have to tease you about saying jerk face.
Well, I couldn't
Pretty
think
sure
of
that's
it.
not what the actual line is.
It is, in fact, not.
Maybe it should have been.
There were 3 swears in there, Kris. I had to cut out 3 swears so that Charlotte wouldn't be scandalized by Beth's language.
Yes, thank you.
But I thought that was a really good panel. I liked that moment a lot for Beth. And it also kind of made me warm and happy. This is maybe getting into something generally that made me warm and happy. I liked that Beth was wearing a flannel shirt, very similar to the one that Sarah wears at the end of season 1, at the end of the miniseries. And she's like sitting on the couch with Mrs. S. It feels, I don't know, she feels a bit more healed and whole, even though she went through something terrible. She looked cozy and a bit more at peace, I guess. And maybe that's just me projecting, but
I'm going to be honest with you. I got to that panel and I flipped back a few pages to make sure I had read it right.
I know.
Because she straight up looks like Sarah there.
She does! That was a bit confusing, but once I realized it was Beth, I was like, oh, I see what they're doing here. They're recontextualizing this, and it's Beth who has gone through a journey and seems like she's maybe coming out into a better place, only to have something terrible happen immediately after that, as is Orphan Black's way.
It's true. I kind of like that in the sense that it mirrors what happens in the series, which is that in a way, Sarah kind of steps into the role that Beth had been in. Mm-hmm. And so when you're reading this, it's like, oh, I see what's happening now. It feels like Beth is sort of starting to become what we saw Sarah become in the series, which is neat and also sad at the same time. Because no!
But I gotta say, just generally, I found the clothing in the comic books to be very pleasing. First of all, I loved Casima's spy hat. She was wearing, I forget what those are called, a Panama hat, I think, but she was wearing like this brimmed hat while she was undercover as a spy. I was like, oh, Casima.
Well, she's got to cover the hair. The hair is too distinctive.
I know, but she wore like this big, kind of obvious hat that not a lot of people wear that style of. But it was a good hat for her. It was a good look on her. Uh-huh. Just not particularly stealthy. But stealthiness is not exactly Casima's forte.
So you're saying she needs to be like Sarah and get a hood of invisibility?
I also love the choice to put Sarah in Allison's ridiculous jumper onesie pajamas for a good chunk of story.
That was so great. It's basically episode 6 of season 1, except Sarah's just in, like onesie pajamas the whole time. You're like, yes, I would believe that Allison would own that.
Absolutely. I thought, of course, Allison owns that as soon as I saw it.
And it somehow just sort of ends up looking like a prison jumpsuit on Sarah.
Because she's been imprisoned by the color pink and she's miserable.
Well, they do have her handcuffed in the craft room, so
that's true.
It kind of fits the whole milieu, if you will.
And I also really enjoyed just seeing an artistic rendering of some of my favorite Casima and Delphine outfits.
Does not surprise me, Stephanie.
I don't know if they did this on purpose, but it did feel like they made an attempt to put in my favorite Delphine and Casima outfits. I feel like maybe they knew they were the favorites of more than just me, that a lot of fans really appreciated these outfits. But it made me very happy to see them included in the comic book. They even had Casima in like her sexy stripy dress that she doesn't wear until the beginning of season 2 on the TV show. But I thought, yes, it made it. And they had Delphine in her outfit she's also wearing in the same scene. Also a good outfit on Delphine. The black, it's not really a tank top, but like a sleeveless shirt and the black pants. She looks good.
Just for you, Stephanie. They did it just for you.
Just for me. I know. Well, they didn't include, I don't think, the Delphine outfit I don't like, so maybe it was just for me. The one that I don't like and everybody else does.
I feel like you owe money to Wayne Nichols now.
And finally, I will say, even though it could be confusing at times, I do think that some of the recontextualization of plot elements that they did were pretty clever, and they weren't always immediately apparent. Like, as I was paging back through to kind of pick out some of my favorite stuff, it occurred to me, in the TV series, we see Sarah going undercover and pretending to be Katja at the hotel, and that doesn't happen here, because Katja survives, and instead, we see Vic mistake Katja for Sarah. I was like, oh, comic book writers, that's pretty clever, the way that you kind of flip that around. Mm-hmm. And there's several kind of moments like that where you think, oh, that happened, but in a slightly different way in the TV series. So I do think that they put some good thought into, okay, how do we incorporate familiar plot elements, but do them a little bit differently? Right,
because we also get that instead of Vic seeing Allison out with her kids and that sort of thing.
And you have kind of classic Orphan Black moments happening between different characters and things like that. So some of that I did find fun and a bit of a challenge for people who've seen the series to sort of recognize, oh yeah, they did do that, but it was slightly different, and here's how.
Oh, just a bit of Orphan Black fan news, too. it has recently been announced that IDW is going to put out another Orphan Black miniseries. And this one's actually going to be, I think they're calling it Crazy Science, starring Cosima and Delphine.
Yay!
I don't know why they thought they'd do this. It's not like anybody is particularly invested in those characters. That's a joke. Nobody send me angry messages, please. It is also going to be written by Helly Kennedy. It is apparently picking up right where season 5 left off, with Cosima and Delphine going across the globe to cure the other clones. It's apparently going to be a 6-issue miniseries, debuting in June 2018. I will link to an article about this in our show notes for this episode.
I know this was our first episode that we put out in a while. We decided not to permanently close down this podcast, but just so you know, this is kind of what you could expect. There could be very long breaks between episodes here just because we have other stuff going on and TV shows that are currently airing that tend to demand more immediate attention. So we still have ideas for episodes for this podcast. We just can't guarantee that we'll put them out on a particular schedule or within a particular time frame. So, please stay subscribed to the podcast. We are, again, we have intentions for future episodes if we have time. It's just we can't promise a particular timeline.
Yes, intentions, but not a definitive schedule.
Exactly.
If you have any thoughts about this podcast or others that you would like to send to us, you can do that in a number of ways. You can email us at feedback@TatianaIsEveryone.com. You can also contact us on Twitter @TIE Podcast. We are also on Tumblr @TatianaIsEveryone Podcast. You can also send us a voicemail at 972-514-7223 or record a voice memo on your smartphone and email it to us.
Tatiana Is Everyone is part of the Ask Genre TV family of podcasts. To find our other podcasts about Lost Girl and Supergirl and other girls. No, I'm just kidding.
It's not completely inaccurate.
And Killjoys, along with some other shows. Bomb Girls, we do have another girl. You can go find those over on our website, askgenretv.com.
Thank you so much for listening.